At this point, you should have developed a pretty good idea about what it takes to be safe in a science laboratory. You've watched the Flynn lab safety video, which does a great job of summarizing what it takes to be safe in the science lab. You've also read the Flynn lab safety contract. At least you've perused it. And that's a much more comprehensive list of all of the things it takes to be safe when you're doing science in a laboratory. In this video, I'm going to share with you my summary of those two sources. I'm going to share with you my 5 lab safety rules that if you follow them, you will cover everything that you saw in the video and everything that you read in that lab safety contract. So we are going to take a look at 5 lab safety rules for this physical science class. 5 rules that if you follow these all the time, hazards will be minimized and the science that we do will be safe. Let's take a look at the 5 rules for lab safety, starting with rule number 1. Whenever there's any kind of emergency or question that you have, you need to alert either the teacher or the adult supervisor that knows that you're doing a lab. Let's back up just a half a step there. Anytime you ever do a lab, you have to make sure that somebody knows what you're doing. Let's say, for instance, as you're doing a lab, an unknown reaction occurs and something explodes and knocks you unconscious. You're going to need immediate medical attention. But what if nobody knew that you were doing a lab and there was nobody around supervising? That would be a serious problem that could lead to serious health consequences or even death. Therefore, it's very important that anytime you do a lab, that lab is authorized and there's somebody that knows that you're doing it, a responsible adult supervisor. You're going to let me know in the science lab if anything happens that I need to know about. That could be a serious emergency, like a fire, a chemical spill, broken glass that got dropped on the floor and needs to be cleaned up. All of those are serious emergencies that need to be attended to right away. And the very first thing you do in any of those cases is to let me know. It just takes a moment, and then I can help to take care of the crisis. In a situation where you're maybe working at home and you have a parent as an adult lab supervisor, in a crisis situation, the very first thing you do is you let them know that there's a problem, that there's an emergency. The same goes for injuries, whether they be serious injuries like really bad burns, cuts that are bleeding very, very badly, or minor injuries like really minor burns, minor chemical stings, a slow bleeding that's not really going to cause a problem in the long run. For any situation that comes up, the first thing you should do is let the lab supervisor know. That way, the lab supervisor can deal with anything that needs to be done to help take care of the situation. And it's a much more organized way of responding to emergencies and injuries. So that's rule number 1. If anything comes up, whether it be an emergency, an injury, or simply a question about how to proceed with the lab, the very first thing you should do is let your lab supervisor or teacher know about it. The next rule is another very important one for being safe in the laboratory, and that's to make sure that you're dressed appropriately. In our physical science lab, one thing we're always going to wear for every single lab is goggles. Sometimes, in addition to goggles, we will need additional protection. So oftentimes we're also going to wear aprons or gloves, although those are not required for every single lab. However, the following dress etiquette is required for every single lab. 3 things that I expect everybody to always think of when they dress for lab is they need to have closed-toed shoes that cover their entire foot. So if they spill something on their foot during a lab, it doesn't get on their skin right away. Also, you aren't allowed to wear baggy clothes that could knock over things on your lab station or dip into the fluids that we use during labs. You have to wear clothes that fit nicely. And then finally, any long hair has to be tied back to keep your hair safe from fire or getting in a chemical or things like that. These are things that every scientist does when they work in the lab to make sure that their lab work is safe. In science, we're going to be using chemicals that are possibly corrosive. That means that when they come in contact with your skin, they will chemically react with your skin changing your skin to a different substance and causing a lot of pain and injury. We're also going to be using some substances that are flammable. If they come in contact with a heat source, they will start on fire, which is an extremely dangerous chemical reaction to have going on uncontrolled in the laboratory. You need to make sure that you respect lab chemicals as you work in a science lab. That means that you're going to make sure you read the labels and understand what chemicals are. You dispose of all chemicals properly. You don't just leave them around for somebody else to be hurt by them later. You make sure that everything you do with chemicals is authorized by the instructor and by your lab supervisor who's watching over you. You also need to avoid contaminating original containers with other chemicals. When you're done using a chemical, if you don't use all of it, never put it back in the container that it came from, because then the next person that uses it isn't going to know that it's 100% pure. Being safe with chemicals in the lab relies on knowing exactly what chemicals you're using and exactly what the hazards are. You want to make sure that you don't contaminate them. And then perhaps the most important rule of all, make sure that when you are finished working in the lab, the very last thing that you do is you wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water before you leave. These are just a sampling of the lab rules that relate to chemicals. But the key is to make sure that you respect chemicals as dangerous, as if any substance you work with in the lab is a dangerous substance and you're going to treat it as such. The fourth rule of lab safety, you need to make sure you are making a conscious effort to be organized in the lab. Now, there's two forms of organization that you need to practice. The first is mental organization. And all that means is that when you come to lab, you need to make sure you know exactly what you're doing. You've read the lab sheet, you understand the steps, you understand the outcome that you're looking for, and you're ready to begin safely. The other thing that means is when you're following directions, you read and follow directions very carefully, and if you get stuck somewhere, you ask the teacher or the lab supervisor for help so that you know what to do next. There's also, in addition to mental organization, things you can do to be physically organized, like keeping your lab area clean and safe. This will minimize fire hazards because you probably won't have flammable substances next to a heat source if your lab area is clean and you know exactly what's there. A clean lab area is a safe lab area, so make sure you keep it clean. It's going to minimize all of those other hazards that we've talked about so far. And then finally, my fifth lab rule is to make sure as a Christian person, you're acting responsibly. And the reason that we're doing that is because our Savior loved us, we want to show love to the other people around us. And the way to do that in the science lab is to not put people in unnecessary danger. So by the way that you act, you're going to make sure that the lab area stays safe. In a safe lab area, there's never going to be any horseplay. No running around and throwing things and goofing off. No sneaking up behind somebody and scaring them. That kind of stuff is not welcome in the laboratory because it leads to unsafe conditions and it leads to injuries. The other thing that won't happen in the lab is talking about things not related to science and goofing around and being raucous and laughing. That has no place in the lab either, because if you're standing around talking at your lab station about things not related to what you're doing, then you're not really paying attention to what's going on around you. And anytime you're in a lab and you're not paying attention to your conditions around you, you are being a hazard to everybody else. Other things to keep in mind, if you see other students being unsafe, make sure you call them on it. That's the loving thing to do. If you see them doing something that's going to injure themselves or others, talk to them about it. Make sure that everybody practices lab safety. And then finally, if you see somebody who's not really getting it, the loving thing to do is to help them to get it. Talk to them about what's going on in the lab. Make sure that they understand. Ask them questions and answer their questions. That's another way that you can act as a responsible Christian person in love in the lab. Well, these are my 5 lab safety rules. If you do these 5 simple things every time we do a lab, I will be assured that this lab is going to be a very, very safe place. And when you do lab work at home, I can be assured that you're going to be safe there as well.